Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another edition to our Westry Horne Cultural and Heritage Lecture Series. I am Safir Jenkins, your host and president of Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club, and it is a great honor to be with you on today as it pleases me to introduce all of you to a profound and impactful lecturer who will be our guest for today. He is Dr. Kelly Harris. Today's topic, just so you understand the gravity of that which we are addressing today, is the impact, the history, and the legacy of African Americans and the labor movement. So Dr. Kelly Harris serves as the Senior Staff Director of the Center for Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to this role, he's held many positions as Professor and Director of Africana Studies. He's been at Seton Hall University, Associate Professor, Director of Africana Studies, and Interim Dean of Honors College at Chicago State University, with over 20 years of experience in higher education as a professor and administrator. He certainly has established his expertise in the areas that matter most for today's topic: Black politics, African politics, Black political thought, African American history, and the history of social science. Listen, you all understand that at Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club, we stand for and foster advancement through service. And one of the ways that we accomplish this is through the diversity of platforms available to us, such as this one, whereby we bring you lectures and lessons and resources that help to empower our community. With knowledge comes power, and with power comes responsibility. So we partner with our community members as well as other agencies and organizations to provide such advancement so that we are better positioned to be not only contributors to the society in which we live, but also benefactors and beneficiaries. So join me today as we welcome to today's broadcast Dr. Kelly Harris.
Thank you very much, Sophia. I appreciate your introduction. I appreciate Frontiers International for having me. It's quite an honor to be here with you all today. And hopefully I can share something that inspire provocative conversation. So I'm going to begin now with Blacks in the Labor Movement, a Tortured History. And this is very timely, I think, as we consider the 2024 election, as President Biden and former President Trump are in a battle for the hearts and minds of labor unions. The report just came out the other day where the Teamsters gave money to both parties, and that hasn't really happened before. It usually just generally goes to the Democratic Party. But we have to consider what the role of the Black labor has in the labor movement. Black people have in the labor movement. So I'm gonna begin, and I have on here this on the opening frame. Matter of fact, let me ask. Text it, put it in the chat if you know who this person is in the chat, and I'll come back to his name later on in our presentation. But it'd be interesting to see if you all are familiar with this person, this gentleman in this chat. But this poem was written in his honor. Rest, rest, old fighter, rest. Your noble deeds by memory blessed. Inspire us all in freedom's quest. Rest, rest, old fighter, rest. So as we begin, we all know that enslaved labor meant so much to the building of this country. What we often don't think about is that enslaved labor wasn't just on the plantations, but they were hired out. And when I say hired out, 90% of the time they didn't receive any of that income that they were being hired out for. The income, of course, went right back to the plantation owner. But they were hired out for skilled and unskilled labor. A large number were sailors, sailmakers, and carpenters. As a matter of fact, in my hometown of Philadelphia, and where I am right now, one of the wealthiest Black Philadelphians at the time was a man by the name of James Fortune, and he made his money sail making, creating things for sailors. Now, um, as we enter the 19th century, and the economy is growing, the country is changing a lot. A lot of people are moving from non-agricultural labor to urban labor, to the urban workforce, and that brings a lot of problems and it brings a lot of challenges. And those challenges, of course, white laborers and organizers are organizing. They're organizing the first labor union. The first one started in the 1780s, but they're organizing labor unions at the turn of the century, not allowing Black people in these labor unions, not allowing them at all. So the racism, of course, that was so endemic in the society, it bled over into the labor unions. Here we have the first federal labor strike in 1835, and Jefferson Morley writes brilliantly about this in Snowstorm in August. All right, 3/4 of the workers walked out. Black hawkers were brought in as strike breakers. Right? Black hawkers were brought in as strike breakers. The white machinists angered at their jobs, and anti-slavery advocates boiled over into a race riot. So this was a formidable race riot. So the Black Caucus formed their own labor union, the Caucus Association, 3 years later, and Frederick Douglass was a part of that. And we'll come back to Frederick Douglass, because one of the things we don't think about when we think about Frederick Douglass, think about him as an abolitionist and a great orator and those things, but he also was a great union man, great union leader. Commonwealth v. Hunt, Supreme Court, and these Supreme Court decisions become very interesting. As a matter of fact, we know 2018, the Janus decision, Supreme Court became very interesting. And of course, we'll get to that when we get to 2018. But this was the first time the Supreme Court passed a law that allowed for unions to be legal and organize closed shops. So prior to this, unions were illegal in the eyes of the law. Well, the ability to strike was illegal in the eyes of the law. All right. So here we have the first national colored labor union, 1850, first black labor union, founded to assist Black skilled craftsmen. And as you can see here, Samuel Ringgold Ward was the first president, and Frederick Douglass, again, great union man, is the first vice president of the American League of Colored Laborers. And it didn't last long, and a part of their challenge was you didn't have that many Black workers to pay into the union. So it's hard to keep a union running when you don't have the money coming. But it was a good attempt to try to organize Black labor workers. The Lynn, Massachusetts strike. So this was the last major strike before the Civil War, where the wages of workers. So, this country, we all think about the Great Depression, but there's always been periods of economic depression. You had one in 1857. We'll see another one in 1873. We'll see another one in 1893. You always had these panic, these economic, and this happens in a capitalist society. You have periods where there's recessions and depressions. So in this major one, workers responded by organizing for better pay, and it spread across New England. Now we have another major labor union, National Labor Union in 1866, which did not allow Black people into the labor union, which led to Black people forming the Colored National Labor Union in 1869. And again, Vice Frederick Douglass becomes its president in 1872. Right? Now, this was the first union really that began to open its doors to Black people, the Knights of Labor. So they were formed in Philadelphia. They were the first organization to bring in large numbers of skilled and unskilled Black workers. And a gentleman you see here, he looks very fair complexion, but he was a great Black journalist, T. Thomas Fortune, or Timothy Thomas Fortune. And everybody just called him T. Thomas Fortune for short. But he was a journalist. He also founded the first national civil rights organization in this country's history, the Afro-American League. He started organizing it for it around 1883, and it was formed in 1889, the National Afro-American League. Brilliant journalist, but this is what he says about the Knights of Labor. Nothing short of potentiality like the Knights of Labor can ever force Southern capitalists to give their wage workers a fair percentage of the results of their labor. If there is any power on earth that can make the white Southern employer of labor face the music, it is organized Black and white labor with the labor power of the nation to sustain it. So you have people like T. Thomas Fortune speaking at that time. If white laborers would drop their racism and see what they have in common, the commonalities they have with black laborers, they could be a strong force. Black people were saying that all throughout the 19th century, but white people, many white laborers, they refused to see that. Black dock workers in Florida struck in 1868. So they were being shut out because this steamship company was bringing in laborers from Canada. And of course, they did that because they could pay them cheaper. So the black workers protested. And this is the thing that we need to understand. So black folk, no matter what time period we see themselves in, we always found ways to resist and to strike. Because a lot of people think, well, 1868, you ain't got no choice. You do what people, you do whatever happens. But black people said, no, we're going to strike. 1868 in Florida, and they successfully protested against the hiring of Canadian stevedores in Florida. So by 1874, the Florida legislature passed a law asserting that dock workers had to have 6 months of Florida residency. So the black dock workers won in that battle. Here we go. So remember, I mentioned the Panic of 1857. Here we have another one, the Panic of 1873. So the boom in stocks and railroads and new financial markets came to a grinding halt. And you always see this. You have these economic booms. We all might remember the dot-com boom and then later the bust. But who always suffers during these booms? Labor, right? Particularly working class and poor labor. So labor took a big hit. And of course, a lot of layoffs. So in 1870, there were 33 national unions. By 1877, there were only 9 national unions. So that gives you insight into what happened to the hit this depression had on labor unions. And we have the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And here you see the picture down here of Peter Humphreys Clark, he's considered the first black socialist in America, from Cincinnati, Ohio. And this is what he says about the strike. I sympathize in this struggle with the strikers, and I feel sure that in this I have the cooperation of 9/10 of my fellow citizens. Every railroad in the land should be owned or controlled by the government. The title of private owner should be extinguished and the ownership vested in the people. And he said that at a mass meeting of the Working Men's Party in Cincinnati in 1877. American Federation of Labor is founded in 1886. And Samuel Gompers, of course, he was a racist, but initially he said that the AFL should represent all workers regardless of race. But the American Federation of Labor refused to charter unions that prohibited blacks from joining. So the first convention for African American delegates joined the convention, but because of the Panic of 1893, again another panic, where black strikebreakers were used, that fomented dissension, and then all of the AFL began granting charters to unions that prohibited black people from joining. And again, Samuel Gompers was an out-and-out bigot. So black people really never had a space in the American Federation of Labor. Haymarket Affair, 1886 in Chicago. And here you see a picture of Lucy Parsons, who was, there's some mystery about who she was. Was she a person of color? Was she a black person? Was she Native American? She always talked about her Native American heritage, but she also, and some people argued that she had parents who were enslaved. We don't know. But this is what she said: never be deceived that the rich will ever permit you to vote away their wealth. Lucy Parsons' husband is here in this picture, Albert Parsons. He was a part of this Haymarket Affair, the people who allegedly planned this bombing at the Haymarket Affair, a labor union protest. Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 prohibited any contract, combination, or conspiracy that restrained free trade. So this was used to make many unions illegal. So this was an attack against unions, and this set unions back quite a bit from that Antitrust Act. Then we have the forming of the Railroad Brotherhoods. Now this becomes very important because prior to the formation of these brotherhoods, Black people and some were able to get pretty good positions as firemen and brakemen in these in the railroads. But after the formation of these brotherhoods, all Blacks employed by the railroads, other than porters and waiters, found their jobs threatened. So that's why porters and maids and waiters became important jobs, good paying jobs for Black people, because those were the only jobs that Black people were allowed to have on the railroads. Because before, when they were allowed to be brakemen and foremen, those jobs got pushed out. And primarily, when we think about this, when you have these economic panics, when you have these depressions, when jobs tighten up, you'll see white workers taking the jobs that Black people, Black and brown people used to have, that white people didn't want. But when those jobs, when the economy tightens up, then people start saying, okay, I need that job, I need that job, I need that job. So Black people got forced out of many of those jobs. Then we have the founding of the American Railway Union, Eugene Debs. And he legitimately wanted to include all Blacks in the American Railway Union, but he was voted down. And they would not allow Black people in the American Railway Union. Now keep that in mind, because when Black people are being forced out, Black leaders and activists are saying, well, if we're not being allowed in these unions, what good are they to us and for us, right? At that time. Pullman strike of 1894. So because of that, remember, Black people are not allowed in the American Railroad Union. Black people are not allowed in American Federation of Labor, shut out in that. Railroad Brotherhood, pushing Black people out only to certain positions. So not surprisingly, African Americans felt no inclination to help the American Railway Union when it challenged the General Manager's Association in 1894. The strike, which started among the Pullman workers, spread to the entire industry. So the Cleveland Gazette, the Black newspaper, said, quote, "Do your duty," they exhorted to Black strike breakers, all right? They exhorted to Black strike breakers, do your duty. So here, Black people are trying to break the strike. They don't have a problem being strike breakers, because they're Black people's focus. Well, if you all aren't being loyal to us, if you all aren't collaborating with us, if you all don't see us as your equal and want to work with us and allow you in your unions, why should we support your strikes? Coxey's Army, unemployed march on Washington, D.C. in 1894. Now, I put this here because this was really one of the first organized marches on Washington in 1894, right, where they actually got to the national capital. It was a majority white march where Black people did participate in this unemployed march. So this march was in large part about labor, right? So here at the end of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, here are some examples of Black people's sentiments towards unions. The Christian Recorder called upon leaders of the race to spell out the danger of cooperating with labor malcontents in their fight against capital. Booker T. Washington charged that labor unions were seriously hindering the economic advancement of Black workers by refusing to organize them and keeping them out of many desirable crafts and trades. Black workers have no choice but to join the employers against the unions. Again, strike breakers. The American, another Black newspaper. They hang the Negro in the South, but they are not so bad in the North. They simply starve him to death by labor unions. And I'll go to the end. W.E. Du Bois advocated a dual position. Negroes should work unceasingly to build Black-white unity in the labor movement, but at the same time, they should challenge and unrelentingly attack segregation and discrimination in the trade unions. Now, the beginning of the 20th century, we have another important Supreme Court decision in Lochner v. New York. The Supreme Court found that the 10-hour workday and the 60-day work week were a violation of the 14th Amendment and therefore unconstitutional. Then we have the Chicago Teamster strike of 1905, and you can see in that picture, Black strike breakers were brought in to drive wagons. Ida B. Wells Barnett, the great journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett, argued that other Black leaders should encourage Blacks to serve as Ida B. Wells and other Black leaders argued that Blacks should be encouraged to serve as strike breakers. So By the end of the 19th, early 20th centuries, Black people have no problem being strike breakers, right? International Workers of the World is founded. And this is really the first major organization other than the Knights of Labor where Black people were welcome into the organization, right? So the IWW had the best track record on the Negro question of all the early unions, all right? Founded in 1905 in Chicago by socialists, anarchists, and Marxists, the IWW was extremely radical and viewed the AFL as too moderate and conservative. Now, I'm not going to go all the way back to the first slide, but I remember I asked you all who was that person on that first slide, and I can't see the chat, so I don't know if you all put it in the chat who the person is, but that person is Ben Fletcher. So, or Benjamin Harris Fletcher, Ben Fletcher for short. So, if you put it in the chat, congratulations on knowing who he was. But Ben Fletcher was a leader in the IWW. He was a longshoreman in Philadelphia. He organized a local in Philadelphia. He became a great spokesperson for the IWW, a national leader in the IWW. But because of the intense scrutiny in 1918, he was the only Black leader in the IWW that, along with other white leaders in the IWW, was convicted and sentenced to prison. He was sentenced to a 10-year prison sentence. So A. Philip Randolph and other Black leaders rallied around him and protested his sentence. Eventually, Warren Harding would commute his sentence in 1923, but he had served 5 years in prison. He was just thrown in with the other people being charged. They did not specifically charge him with doing anything in particular, but that was happening at the time. And that was really a part of the nation's early counterintelligence programs against radicals, against people who saw themselves as socialist Marxists, against a lot of Black labor leaders and Black organizers. Marcus Garvey, of course, during this time, Hubert Harrison during this time, the NAACP and W.E.B. Du Bois, people in the Harlem Renaissance, and so on and so on and so on. We can go on down the line. But that's a whole nother presentation that we're not going to do today, but just it bears noting that at this particular time. So we have a major strike in Arizona, mining town run by the Phelps Dodge Corporation, which oversaw working conditions that were extremely poor. So the IWW organized a union to support striking workers. A local vigilante group was formed, and 2,000 people were arrested, and only those who were not members of the IWW were allowed to renounce the IWW to avoid deportation. The National Association of Wage Earners, founded in 1921 by this sister in the white, well, the sister in the front in the white and the glasses, Nannie Helen Burroughs, who also, by the way, started her own training school for girls in 1908. And by the way, since we're in Black History Month, she made it was mandatory for her girls to take a class in African American history. And to my knowledge, that was the first educational institution which mandated the teaching of African American history. So Nannie Helen Burroughs gets kudos for that. But this labor movement, she organized Black domestic workers in a National Association of Wage Earners in 1921. Then we get the National Industrial Recovery Act. So this is in the 1930s, a part of the New Deal, and the New Deal had a not so good track record when it came to how it impacted Black people and Black women in particular. Then we get the founding of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids. Right? It was founded in the 1920s, but it struck a collective bargaining pact with the Pullman Company in 1937, the first time a major Black union and a major white union struck such a compact. During that same time, in the founding of it, another Black woman, Rosina Tucker, you see on the left, she helped establish not only the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, but she also established the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters' first International Ladies Auxiliary Order. And she would go on to be a part of the organizing for the March on Washington, which we'll see later. People can't forget that the March on Washington was about jobs and justice. And it was Black women who insisted that jobs be in there. and it did not be a march just about justice. And next to Rosina Tucker, by the way, in the middle is A. Philip Randolph, in case you all did not know. So now we have the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, called the Wagner Act for short. Now, this act, again, it did some good things, but it left out domestic and farm workers. Okay? It excluded domestic and farm workers. So those provisions discriminated against Black workers. And again, primarily women were impacted by that. So that bears understanding. So even though Roosevelt did some good things, those things in terms of labor, it still was discriminatory against Black workers. Now we have the National Negro Congress. So now let me put this in context. So in the early 1930s, the major Black organization, now remember, the UNIA is still around, but the UNIA, Marcus Garvey had been deported back to Jamaica. So Marcus Garvey's not around. The UNIA isn't as strong or as influential as it once was. The NAACP is really seen as the major national Black organization. But the NAACP kind of lost a little of its luster during the early 1930s in the case of the Scottsboro Boys. The Scottsboro Boys were 9 young men who were arrested for allegedly raping some young white women. Of course, they didn't. NAACP was slow to come to their defense, but the American Communist Party did come to their defense. So you had Black people looking to the Communist Party and the Socialist Party of America as alternatives to the NAACP and other things, right? So given that, and A. Philip Randolph had started off as a communist in the 19-teens. A. Philip Randolph, when he founded the Messenger, major Black newspaper in the 1917, A. Philip Randolph located himself as a communist. Later, he would denounce it. By this time, though, by 1935, in the formation of the National Negro Congress, A. Philip Randolph, along with Ralph Bunche, this was really the height of the Communist Party efforts to organize the labor movement in the United States. And Ralph Bunche would go on to win a Nobel Peace Prize, the first Black person to win a Nobel Peace Prize, and the first person to become an ambassador to the United Nations. Then you have another major strike, the GM Flint strike of 1936, which also would bring up contradictions about race and how Black workers were being treated at GM. Then we have the Fair Labor Standard Act of 1938, another act that does one good thing, led to a federal minimum wage, but exempted farm workers and domestic laborers, leading to low incomes for people of color, right? So again, an imbalance in terms of how Black people are faring from these important decisions around labor in the United States. Then we get the Ford Motor Company strike of 1941, where Henry Ford refused to recognize the United Auto Workers. So the United Auto Workers responded by joining the union, and at least 8 were fired as workers responded by joining the union. At least 8 people were fired as a result. The NAACP, the National Negro Congress, convinced Black workers not to serve as strike breakers and to show solidarity with the United Auto Workers. Now, that's a very important moment, and that's why I put this in there. Given the context that I talked about earlier, where at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, where Black leaders were encouraging Black people to serve as strike breakers. So by this 1941, this is a really kind of a watershed moment for the NAACP and the National Negro Congress to encourage Black workers not to serve as strike breakers and to show solidarity with the UAW. All right. Another major act, the Labor Relations Management Act of 1947, called the Taft-Hartley Act. All right. This restricted the power of unions, required the union leader signing non-communist pledge. Now, again, this is Truman's America, all right, where people were having these loyalty oaths, and we also get this is the era of McCarthyism in the United States, where communism was under every rock, right? And This had a very significant impact on the civil rights movement. The NAACP lost thousands of members nationally because people had to take these loyalty oaths and prove that they were not, quote unquote, a communist. All right. So Taft-Hartley Act will be overturned in the 1960s, but it empowered the government to use injunctions to stop serious strikes. So states were allowed to pass right-to-work laws, and we could talk about that later. The National Negro Labor Council, and there you see Paul Robeson, Coleman Young, who to his left will become mayor of Detroit, but Paul Robeson also a great labor man. So African-American gains in the workforce during the 1940s were being reversed. 900 African-American leaders met in Chicago in 1950 to discuss the problem. So in 1951, this is what we have founding the National Negro Labor Council. And of course, they were labeled as communists and eventually had to disband in 1956. And of course, Paul Robeson, along with W.E.B. Du Bois and other leaders, had their passports taken from them. Their ability to make money and earn income was suffered significantly during the 1950s. Paul Robeson, of course, was a great international entertainer and labor organizer and activist. Paul Robeson went from making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to making less than $10,000 a year because of the counterintelligence program that was waged against him to stop him from his organizing. So, of course, the AFL and CIO merged in 1955. Landrum-Gifford Act, another important act, 1959. Unions were required to hold secret elections. Members of the Communist Party and unconvicted felons were barred from membership. Say that again. Members of the Communist Party and convicted felons were barred from membership. Right? So the ban on communism wasn't ruled unconstitutional until 1965. And this act strengthened the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Then we get in 1960 response to the AFL-CIO merging of the Negro American Labor Council. So the AFL-CIO still, remember the AFL had a long history of racism, and that didn't change when they merged with the AFL-CIO. So the Negro American Labor Council was formed to confront that racism. A. Philip Randolph, again, was the first president. Cleveland Robinson was the vice president. So this council issued the call for the March on Washington. So you all remember now, March on Washington, when Dr. King was speaking, I want you to picture in your mind, you saw people with white hats. Those are labor organizers, labor leaders, the people with the white hats on, right? And here you see Anna Arnold Hedgeman, who was a great leader in the NAACP for years, but she was one of the organizers of the March on Washington. She's the one that demanded, that said, insisted that jobs had to be put in terms of the call in the March on Washington for jobs and justice, right? So we can't forget the role that Black women played in labor organizing. That kind of goes by the wayside sometimes when we think about this labor history. National Farm Workers Association, founded in 1962, and I'll come back to that in terms of the Poor People's Campaign, which here we see. So Dr. King at the end of his life. So Dr. King, now you all have to remember, you get the victories of the Civil Rights Act. You get the Civil Rights Act in 1957. You get the Civil Rights Act in 1964. You get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You get the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But Dr. King, all these acts are being passed, and Dr. King and other leaders realize that this still doesn't really transform the country in a way that it needs to be transformed, right? And so Dr. King really started focusing on issues of poverty, right? So here's what's interesting. And I'm going to read this whole piece because it's very important. The campaign was planned as militant civil disobedience and an effort to mobilize the unemployed, including workers left behind by deindustrialization in the cities and by mechanization in the countryside. Let me pause there, because this was being talked about a lot. And there were a few books that came out during that time. One was called Who Needs the Negro by Sidney Wilhelm, right? And there was another one that's escaping me that's even prior to that was very important. But these books are talking about deindustrialization, jobs going overseas, what's going to happen to the Black worker now? And it's interesting because what are we going to do with the Black workers? Because Black people had access to certain jobs during the 1950s and 1960s, right? Those jobs are going overseas. So now what happens? One of the things that happens, you all, is we see the influx of drugs in the Black communities in the 1970s on, and we see the increase of the prison industrial complex. The prison industrial complex grows tremendously from the late 1960s, early 1970s up to the present day, where we have close to 3 million people in the prison industrial complex. At the late 60s, early 1970s, there were less than 200,000 in the prison industrial complex. So that's the key important thing. All right. So Dr. King received little support from the unions and traditional civil rights leadership. So again, the march is a poor people's campaign to mobilize the unemployed, including workers left behind by deindustrialization. Yet, King received little support from the unions and traditional civil rights leadership. We need to ponder that and unpack that. Part of that reason may be because of King's stance on Vietnam. And you all have to remember that a lot of the labor unions at that time were dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were proud to be American and who were very upset about anybody not wanting to support the war effort. So King's stance against the Vietnam War rubbed a lot of people in those labor unions the wrong way, right? So the following were his main supporters for the Poor People's Campaign: the National Welfare Rights Association, where Black women led militant protests; the United Farm Workers, that's Cesar Chavez; Mexican American Nationalists, and poor whites from Appalachia, right? So the traditional civil rights groups really weren't behind it. SCLC, of course, did, because that was his organization. But a lot of traditional civil rights groups, they were lukewarm to this idea of a Poor People's Campaign. What did they demand? Allocate resources to provide jobs, guarantee annual income for those unable to work or unable to find work. That was a big thing King focused on at the end of his life, a guaranteed national income. Resources to train jobless youth for skilled jobs. That's still something we should be arguing for, and still people do argue for, right? Resources to train jobless youth for skilled jobs. Resources to build 6 million decent new homes, right? So, and this is why today, to this day, you still have a Poor People's Campaign being led by Reverend Barber, right? As a matter of fact, there's a Poor People's Campaign march coming up on March. I don't want to give the wrong date, but I believe it's March 4th. Well, I might be wrong on that, but it's early March where that date, that Poor People's Campaign is taking place. National Domestic Workers Union, right? Another one founded by a Black woman, Dorothy Roberts. Not Dorothy Roberts. I forget her. I'm blanking on her last name. Somebody can help me out in the chat. Founded there to help domestic workers, 1968. Dodge Revolutionary Movement, or DRUM for short, in Detroit, developed in response to the failure of the UAW to adequately address working conditions at Chrysler plants and the racism in the white-led union. Black auto workers were consistently in the lowest paying jobs and no opportunities to advance into management. They led a wildcat strike that lasted for 3 days in 1968. So out of that came the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, right? And these Black workers in Detroit, these people were inspired really in many ways by Malcolm X. Malcolm X, one of his last major speeches was in Detroit in 1965. And when he gave message to the grassroots and he talked about the ballot of the bullet or whatever, you had these Black organizers in Detroit. Detroit had a very rich organizing tradition, particularly in the late 50s and 1960s. Coalition for Community Action, United Community Action in Chicago, right? You see the leader there, David Reed. KUCA was the brainchild of Reverend C.T. Vivian. C.T. Vivian, of course, marched with Dr. King and was composed of representatives from street gangs. Latin American Task Force, Operation Breadbasket, and Black construction contractors. So on July 22nd, 1969, the coalition shut down construction sites on the south and west sides that were valued at more than $80 million. You know, I was in Chicago from 2010 up until 2019, and that was still an issue. And you would still have people trying to shut down. As a matter of fact, I was at a lecture last night with Alden Morris. He teaches at Northwestern, great Black sociologist. He wrote a book called The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement. He also wrote a more recent book on W.E.B. Du Bois called The Scholar Denied, about how he's been denied in sociology because he really was one of the founders of scientific study of sociology. But at any rate, Alden Morris and I were recalling when I was in Chicago, where we participated in a protest and shutting down a construction site because they weren't hiring Black workers. And this was around 2012, 2013. But the person who led the strike was Edward Gardner, the founder of Sauce Sheen. Edward Gardner just died a few years ago. He made it he was about 89, 90 years old when he did that. Edward Gardner was driving past a work site. He didn't see any Black workers. So this 80-something-year-old man stopped his car, got out, and stood in the wet cement and refused to move. Word got out, and Black people came the next day and supported Edward Gardner in that protest, and we started shutting stuff down. And people were recalling KUKA, you know, what happened in the late 60s, early 1970s. I mean, it happened throughout Chicago's history, you know, post-1960 history, where street gangs were organizing, shutting down work sites and demanding jobs for people, right? So they demanded training for workers with or without a police record, right? With or without a police record. Remember, the Landgraf-Griffin Act was said, well, people who had a conviction could not be members of union. So they are saying no, with or without training for workers with or without a police record. Demanded that 40% of the journeymen are Black. Then we get the Coalition of Black Trade Unions, also founded in Chicago, organized in 1972. More than 1,200 Black union officials attended, making it the largest gathering of Black unionists in American history. And again, they formed this to challenge and offset the AFL-CIO. So as late as the 1970s, AFL-CIO was not seen as representing Black interests. Then we get the big blow to unions, Ronald Reagan and Patco. And some of you on here may remember this even better than I, because I was just a child when this happened. But I want you all, either in the chat or in the discussion, to talk about Ronald Reagan and Patco, what he did in shutting down the air traffic controller strike and really breaking the back of the union when he did. So when people talk about Reagan, and you know, I've heard discussion, some people argue that Reagan was this great president thing. We have to remember not only what he meant for African Americans and people of color, but also what he meant to labor unions, right? So when we get to the labor movement at the turn of the 21st century, and a lot of this calls for Paul Fryman. Paul Fryman did some excellent research on the labor movement. At the turn of the 21st century, African Americans accounted for roughly 20% of the labor movement. It was not until the 1970s that unions, prodded by litigation costs, joined with employers to implement affirmative action programs, apprentice training, and the integration of previously segregated job and seniority lines. By the end of the 1970s, 1 in 4 Black workers belonged to a union. Between 1964 to 1985, the percentage of unionized workers dropped from 30% to 18% and is currently at 10%, right? Now, public sector union workers, we're looking at roughly 30-odd%. Since 2000, African-American union membership has declined by over 400,000. According to Paul Fryman, the abandonment of the Democratic Party, something else we can talk about in the discussion. The abandonment of the Democratic Party by significant numbers of white union members allowed for Republican presidents to change composition of the National Labor Relations Board, leading to overturning of dozens of labor doctrines, and the Democratic Party has become more conservative on race and class. One can argue that that's changed recently, but it's still a battle within the Democratic Party. One would say between progressives and moderates. Progressives tend to be, of course, more progressive on race and class issues, and the moderates tend not to be so. And a part of this is attributed, the Democratic Party, I don't know if you all know this particular part of its history, um, but when Reagan won, after Reagan won two times, in 1980, 81, 1980, and in 1984, you had the formation of a Democratic Leadership Council that was formed in 1985. But that Democratic Leadership Council was formed, and they were trying to figure out, well, where Reagan cleaned our clock 2 years in a row, Republicans did, how are we going to get another Democrat elected president? And one of the things they said, that the problem is that we identified the Democratic Party is closely tied to issues of the interest groups from the 1960s, primarily Black, women, and labor. So that was the problem with the Democratic. So they had to shift their analysis away from that, to shift their language away from that. And we'll talk about that as well. So that changed really how the Democratic Party did things. And of course, we have, in contemporary times, Chris Smalls, right? Founded the first Amazon labor union. He founded the Congress of Essential Workers in 2020 after being fired for Amazon, and really did something amazing in organizing this successful Amazon labor union. They're still struggling because I think they're still the only one. Amazon still refuses to sit down and meet with them and bargain with them. But that's where we are right now. So this is from a story from last year, PBS NewsHour, October 11, 2023. Labor movements are seeing historic victories this year. Can unions keep up the momentum? And so what's driving union activity now? At least 457,000 workers have participated in 315 strikes in the US just this year, right? The strikes have led to more than 7.4 million days of missed work in 2023, the highest level in almost a quarter century. Labor activism is reaching a boiling point amidst soaring costs of living and rising inequality, particularly the growing pay gap between workers and top executives. Those inequities only became more glaring during the COVID-19 pandemic as U.S. corporations raked in profits. And we have to think about, what does that mean for Black workers, right? So I know that was a long presentation. I hope it's been provocative enough to give us a good, fertile environment to have a discussion. So thank you very much.
Dr. Harris, thank you so very much for the information and all of the insights that you've provided thus far today. We do have a few questions that have come in that I'll be sharing now so that we can get the Q&A segment started. But what does resonate with me is that throughout this lengthy process and the inclusion, and even the leadership that we took on as part of the labor movement, even when it seemed that we were excluded and we were apparently not very well valued by leaders in those labor unions. Our persistence in standing our ground and ensuring that we influence those outcomes certainly was profound. And that, to me, is an area of great opportunity today, given that as a people, we are far more segmented within society and in many ways far less organized as a result of that and other factors. So the first question that came in says that many of the trends that we observed in the 60s are still visible today. I mean, really throughout the time period that you even covered, whereby as a people, our political backing is often taken for granted, right? And our power as a result is limited, both collectively and in many ways individually. So what do you think we can do to galvanize a more organized and strategic approach to ensuring that we have appropriate representation for the most critical matters for the Black community?
Well, that's an excellent question. And the easy answer is organize, but the more involved answer is that people have to become educated on how politics works and how the system works, particularly at the local level. Of course, a lot of information, a lot of discussion will center around the presidential election. Is very important. Of course, it's very important if we just look at the Supreme Court and federal judgeships across the nation. And a lot of times people miss that when we think about the composition of the Supreme Court. Trump, I think, put in 3 justices last time, and if he gets in again, he might be able to put in another one. Who knows? But at any rate, organizing, I think, at the local level and getting involved at the local level, understanding how politics works, really getting young students involved in that process of how politics works at the local level. You know, what we've done when I was at Seton Hall and working with MAPSO Freedom School, Maplewood South Orange Freedom School in New Jersey, and Maplewood, of course. TJ Whitaker is the leader of that. He helped organize and co-sponsored a convention that we organized for high school students. But that convention challenges students to come up with resolutions, to collaborate, come up with policy solutions to issues. And I think things like that, and not tooting our own horn, but just it doesn't have to be that, it could be something else. But just getting young people to think about policy and how policy is made, the impact of money in politics, the impact of networking, and just the impact of protests. And how do you negotiate? How do you make demands? Those things, I think, a lot of times we don't, and not just young people, we have a whole lot of adults that don't know how to do it. Far too many of us think that sharing a tweet or an Instagram page is protest, or that we're being, we're holding down the cause. And that, it's nice, but that's not enough. We have to get engaged, going to city council meetings, continue the old things we're doing, of course, voting, but understanding how the political process works. I think we have to do a lot of work in our communities around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've demonstrated what's possible, even when we had Barack Obama running the very first time, and even again the second time, the amount and overwhelming increase of voters turning out, Black voters in particular, is a stark difference from what we see traditionally. And to your point, right, technology, social media can sometimes give us a sense of seclusion and perhaps impact, when in reality, it could be used as a means for communication, as a means for organizing, but certainly should not be taken as a means to an end when it comes to making an impact. It's not itself a means for boycotting or for other social movements whereby we can take action and really show up to do so.
I'm always tickled, but I've been studying African American history, really, history period, Black history, African history, all that, really seriously since I was about 17, 18 years old. That's been my life, right? And I've been teaching for quite some time. But it's funny to me, it's amazing to me. I still have relatives who will send me something, a text or a tweet, like I didn't know. I didn't know about it. And I don't know everything. I don't want to get that important. I don't know everything. It's a whole lot of stuff I don't know, right? But they'll send me stuff. But then if I invite them to something, to attend something, they don't show up. And so we need people to just, it's good to tweet, it's good to do that stuff. But when it's other things, show up to it. Go to these lectures, go to these discussions, get involved in the dialogue. One of the things that we see in history throughout, one of the beautiful things in this country in the 19th century, because we didn't have so many distractions in terms of television and phones and those things, people were so engaged in lectures and dialogue, and having these debates was so very important. Even if you remember Lincoln, when he first, going for Senate, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, those are very historic, him and Stephen Douglas, right? But those debates become so very important, and having those dialogues so very important. We still have that to a certain extent in the barbershop, but as you can tell, I miss those. I don't get those anymore because I don't have to go to the barbershop anymore.
I'm with you.
Yeah, so, I just got to go sit in the barbershop and just chill and just have, dialogue. But we have to have those. We could have those in our churches. We could have those with like organizations like Frontiers International. We need to have those conversations, and we really need to get people there. So if people want to tweet this information out, okay, great. Since you're interested, come on. We're having a discussion. Come on and join us, and let's figure out how to solve these problems.
Yeah. No, very, very good points. There's a second question that came in from Gloria Montealegre, and actually she's one of our partners that is so instrumental in ensuring that each year we engage the community of Plainfield through our annual MLK Memorial Celebration. But she's asking, where are African Americans laborers working today? Like what and which industries see more AA labor amongst all of them?
Unfortunately, I still you see those low wage industry positions. You still see us in the transit industry. You see us in health industry, but not at the top. You know,
Mhm.
as low wage workers and unskilled workers. We still lag behind in terms of skilled workers. That's still a problem. Even though we make up a large part of the workforce,
Right.
we still are not really. We're still not getting in the trades like we should or should be able to. We're still shut out in many ways. It's still hard to get those union cards and those licenses from unions and to be a part of unions. It's still hard.
Yeah.
And you know, that's why we all know, and it's unfortunate. I don't know how many do it. I don't know if everybody does it like me, but when we drive by a work site, when you see the people holding the cones and holding the flag and all that, you see the people drilling, we look at their composition. Who are they? And generally, the people who doing the drilling and doing the work and all that kind of stuff are non-Black.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right?
And you see it everywhere. It doesn't matter the location, right? It can be in an urban center. It can be in a predominantly Black neighborhood. You're absolutely right. That composition remains consistent.
Yeah, and I think that's something in terms of when we're thinking about political strategies, it's something that we should be talking about. There's a few things that we don't talk about that we need to talk about more. And definitely Blacks in the labor movement and where we are today is definitely one of them, particularly in the skilled trades. That's one of them. This is an aside, but maternal health issues. That's another one. When we talk about Black women's maternal health and stuff like that. But those are just examples of things that we need to talk about more.
Yeah. I mean, maternal health and even the health disparities overall that we experience.
That's right.
You know, so all of that could be changed with more representation, with more folks at the top that represent us and look like us. And in many ways, what I find, and it's painfully evident, but when you are consumed by a job where we're secluded oftentimes to those lower wage positions, you have less flexibility. You have less autonomy. So when it comes to participation, civic engagement, political or societal unrest, where we need to be present, oftentimes it's harder to do so because it comes with more risk. And so families and parents are forced to make that tough decision between showing up and risking losing their job.
And particularly, we deal with single mothers and the issues of child care. You know, those are significant issues.
Absolutely. There's another question that just came in from our very own John Brinkley. He asks, what would you say is currently the strongest and most active labor union across the states?
Not just for Black folk, but in general.
In general, in that question, yeah.
Probably the police.
Yeah, so it's funny you say that, which seemed to align very well with expectations. But he also mentions in his other question, which is more of a comment, don't unions like the Fraternal Order of Police move Blacks away from unions? So that's a good question. I just wonder if that's still the case.
Yeah. Well, the teachers union still has a lot of impact and influence. It depends on where though. Sometimes in some cities it's more impactful than others. But the teachers, but the police, they have an overarching impact. You know, it's very interesting because during the times of the Black Lives Matter, particularly around the George Floyd protests and other protests, there had been some inroads, but the language about defunding the police worked against us.
Yeah, it did.
Even though the substance was correct.
Right. That language is more, I would say it's more confrontational, more oppositional. It gives the impression that you're looking to destabilize police.
As if
Yeah.
you're gonna have a
And then,
wild, wild west. And
right.
unfortunately, that language didn't help. Even though when we unpack it and understand what the argument is, it makes sense.
Right.
But that's not what happened. And I raised that because that the police rebounded from that, and now they're getting the support again. People's not talking
Yeah.
about defund the police more, and the police
Yeah.
you have been strengthened. And you see mayors like in New York, Mayor Adams, even in my city, Philadelphia. Now you see the mayor. They're talking about doing things and giving more resources again to the police because of these violence in the cities and things of that nature.
Right.
And it's unfortunate because again, when we think about how to address these problems, a lot of it does have to do with jobs and skills for these young people
Yeah.
and getting them the training they need and things that they need. And so we really need to push the line in terms push back a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because to your point, the substance itself was really all about shifting and reallocating funding so that you
Right.
have mental health resources, you have more proactive responses that you can give before policing becomes engaged in
That's right.
response to issues. And so, in many ways, it worked against us using that type of language because of the fact that now, to your point, they've been strengthened, they've been galvanized now to double down, if you will, in many ways. So,
And, it's interesting too when we look at Dr. King, and he's somebody of course, many of us respect, but Dr. King, when the Watch riot happened, when the Watch Rebellion happened in 1965, people were asking him to come out and say something against the black people who were participating, and he wouldn't do it.
mm,
And the problem he said, he said that the riot is the language of the unheard. And he said, we have to address the underlying issues that cause people to riot. And I bring that up because we have to address the underlying issues of violence in our society,
yes,
right? We know our family members, we know our community. These people ain't just crazy, right?
right,
They might be engaged in bad stuff, they might get caught up in bad stuff, but we have to engage in what creates the violence in these cities, the physical violence. And
right,
one way of doing that is addressing what we call abstract violence. Abstract
mm,
violence is being unemployed. Abstract violence is being underemployed,
yeah,
right? In terms when we think about labor issues, abstract violence is not having the training one needs
right,
for the economy
yeah,
that we have now. And that's what we saw in the 1970s. We didn't see a shift as the economy changed. We didn't see people who were trained for the old economy get trained for the new economy, right? We didn't see that, particularly in Black and brown communities. So, and that's still hampering us.
yeah. Yeah, there's a comment from Gloria Montealegre. I just want to read it. It's not a question necessarily, but certainly could add to the insights that we're sharing. She says, we need to develop more skill options for students. Her husband was able to succeed and feed his family as a railroad worker, as a welder, and later becoming one of less than 1% African-American railroad supervisors in the entire Eastern Seaboard. And so he earned his welding certificate as an 18-year-old. Why can't we have more of these outlets for kids? Also, more African Americans need to think about integrating this industry again.
Yeah, I think those jobs used to be available, but they're not available like they used to be because of the changing economy. I think she's absolutely right, and I had alluded to that earlier. When we look in the 1950s and the 1960s, we saw people being able to get in certain industries and being able to stay there their whole life and have a good living and
Yeah,
send their children to college and things of that nature. And
right.
those opportunities just are not available anymore. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. One of the reasons, of course, is that people aren't being trained for certain things. The other thing is many of these jobs are located in outside the city,
Yeah,
right? In suburbs of the city where people don't know about the jobs,
right.
or where it's hard to get to them,
Yeah,
right? So public transportation don't go to certain places. So I mean, there's a lot that we have to unpack in terms of that. But again, that goes with the changing economy, the deindustrialization that happened a lot across America in the 1960s, in the early 1970s. Then jobs that left that never came back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jobs that left never came back. So there's a lot that we have to chew on in terms of that.
Yeah. And to add to that, really, I mean, it also means we need to innovate our skills training, right? We have to innovate where we are preparing our children, this next generation, for jobs of the future, right? Oftentimes, what I find is that we find ourselves stuck with trying to push narratives and defend our position where we are in the position of losing. And I absolutely understand that. But we also have to take measures and matters into our own hands to begin to develop the skills necessary for the future, for the innovative society that's forthcoming. And in many ways, yes, it includes the trades. It also includes science, technology, math, right? We have to incorporate all of these things in a really cohesive and exhaustive fashion so that we have a robust group of individuals prepared for the labor force or the workforce in the future as it continues to change. It's changed already. That change will not slow down in our lifetime.
And the need for plumbers will never go out of style.
Very
The
true.
need for electricians will never go out of style. The need for automotive mechanics will never go out of style.
Yeah.
It might change the way cars, but it won't go
Right.
out of style. You'll still need a mechanic. So and it's not, and those are jobs that are good. They can last a long time. We have
Absolutely.
to understand that and push that. And I don't know why we don't.
Yeah.
But we have to encourage people to do that, particularly people who are turned off by traditional education. Not everybody needs to be a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, all those kind of things.
Right.
And you make good income. You can have a good life for yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's another question that says, given the importance of Black history and American history at large, including the atrocious history of slavery and the annihilation, discrimination, and oppression of Blacks in America, it is disheartening to see the seemingly successful efforts of those who wish to whitewash history, removing factual literature from classrooms about Black history or about the history of violence against Black people in America, to purportedly protect white children from feeling bad. How did we get here? And what are some steps we can take to foster a more just labor environment and society overall?
Well, we got here because this is the way it's always been. So that's a simple answer. But I don't mean to be flip, but this is a long-standing struggle that we've had in this country. So let me attack this in a few ways. So when Carter G. Woodson founded Negro History Week, Carter G. Woodson actually was standing in the tradition of Black educators who were bibliophiles from the 19th century, right? So you had these Black historical societies in the 19th century, and the whole purpose was Black people understood the need to have these societies, to have reading rooms, to collect books in order to teach ourselves history, in order to teach ourselves these. So Black people understood there's a long tradition in the 19th century. So by the time Carter G. Woodson comes, he's standing on the shoulders of people who've been doing that for many years. And he was involved in groups who did that. In New York, you had the Schomburg Museum, Arthur Schomburg, Arturo Schomburg, the Afro-Puerto Rican, who was the founder of a historical society in New York, along with John Edward Bruce, a great newspaper man. John Edward Bruce talked about being inspired by Alexander Crummell. Alexander Crummell was born in 1819. Alexander Crummell inspired W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois had a chapter about Alexander Crummell and his Souls of Black Folk called Of Alexander Crummell. And he talked about how this great regal figure. So we stood on those shoulders. So Carter G. Woodson comes in, Negro History Week, the need to teach ourselves our own history. I mentioned Nannie Helen Burroughs mandating African American history in her training school for girls in 1908, right? So we had that history. We had people focusing on that. We had people doing that. But what's happened in today's society is that people have shrunk from that. Even black folk, people have shrunk from that. And this whole idea of Black history is somehow limiting. That has taken hold among people that somehow limiting you, somehow limits you. Well, Black history, and John Henry Clark can say this all the time, Black history are the missing pages of world history. And that's the thing that we had to understand. And that's the thing that our white allies and friends and some who are not friends have to understand. That not teaching Black history, not teaching Latino history, not teaching Indigenous history, not teaching women's history, these things don't help anyone. It hurts everybody by leaving that part of their history out. And the other thing, people had to stop being so sensitive. This country has a great history and it has an ugly history. And we need to know both, and we need to understand both. And the fact that we can talk about Andrew Jackson as a racist president and talk about the racist things he did is not an attack on white people.
Right.
That's just saying this is who this cat was.
Right.
When we talk about the Civil War being a struggle that really was won because of an issue over slavery, that's not a lie. That's what it was.
Right.
The Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery. It's not an attack on white people. It's just this is what we have to understand. So I think that we have to really be honest about it. And people, and as we all know, if we look at the news every day, honesty is the last thing people are willing to do right now in the way America is, right?
Yeah.
Trying to find an honest person, man, is very hard. Yeah. But it's a constant struggle. It's a long struggle. And unfortunately, I don't see it ending anytime soon.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's for those reasons we have to be vigilant. We certainly need to be determined in our hearts to share and spread the truths of our history, such as in segments like today. And so I so appreciate your presence today, your willingness to delve deeply into these topics. And, without reservation, I think that the approach you've taken by giving the facts, by not shrouding them in an elaborate form of messaging for the purpose of neutralizing the impact is second to none. So I appreciate, again, your presence here today. I want to thank you for sharing with all of us. We're getting feedback from everyone. I can see even here, same with Gloria Montealegre, where she mentions, thank you so very much. Dr. Harris, she says, great lecture and historical summary of laborers in the USA. So we all thank you.
Gloria.
So, at this time, ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare to close for today, I want to thank you all so much for joining us. It is your participation, your engagement, and your development and positioning for advancement that matters most to us. So we are truly appreciative of your partnering with us. If you find it appropriate and you are willing to do so, we certainly encourage everyone to further partner with us by donating either to our scholarship fund and or to the initiatives that we put forth like this one today. To do so, you can give online at bit.ly/Plainfield Frontiers donate, bit.ly/Plainfield Frontiers donate. You will be able to make a contribution without any fees or taxes whatsoever, because we've partnered with a new provider who does not charge any processing fees at all. So that's a tremendous opportunity there. Otherwise, you can make your donations by mail by sending a check payable to Frontiers International Plainfield to P.O. Box 428, Plainfield, New Jersey, 07061. I will leave that information here in the banner for the duration of my closing, but I thank you again for joining us today. Stay tuned because we have more coming in the near future. And more importantly, we are gearing up for this year's first annual Advancement Gala, where we will engage with community members in partnership for the future of this organization and all of the initiatives that we bring to the Plainfield and surrounding areas. But more importantly, we are going to celebrate our wins, identify our opportunities, overcome whatever challenges might exist so that we can forge ahead and maintain advancement through service. I am Safir Jenkins, host for today and president of Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club. I thank you and I bid you adieu. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday and your weekend. Goodbye.